Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for joining us again today for our May Advisory Council meeting, and we'll be having a few more May, June, July, August, with the large planning task in front of us. And so again, thank you everybody for coming. As usual, I would like to quickly go around the room and for folks to indicate that they're here. We do record the meetings. It helps us as we prepare notes and summaries from the meetings, and also we'd like to find out who's on the phone. But Jean, do you want to start?
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Since I caught you with it.
And I work for MedChi. I'm from the Urban Institute, and I'm working with Maryland Healthcare for All.
Lenny Preston with the Maryland Women's Coalition for Healthcare Reform, and if you come to where I've been on Thursday night, you'll find out what our new name is.
Dr. Ram Tarabemba, First Colony Anesthesia Associate.
Lamarda Edwards, Internal Medicine, Baltimore County.
Hi, I'm Tom Walsh. I'm a primary care physician from Maryland Primary Care Physicians.
Carmela Coyle, Maryland Hospital Association.
Howard Head, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene.
Jack Meyer, Health Management Associate.
Donna Kinzer, HSCRC.
Judy Giroux, HSCRC.
Steve Ford, HSCRC.
David Blumenthal from the Commonwealth Fund.
I'm Joe Ross from Meredith.
Bob Krenzik, University of Maryland.
Eric Wagner, MedStar Health.
Peggy Nowak, Representative Regional Health System.
And do we have anyone on the webinar?
Bruce Vladeck from Nexera in New York.
Okay. Well, with that, I will actually turn things over to Jack. And thank you again.
Okay. Well, welcome, and I appreciate everybody coming out today. I know there were a couple of people who wrote me that they're traveling and just weren't able to join either in person or on the phone. That includes Kevin Sexton and Vince Ancona, and there may be one or two that are still coming in. We want to, and also you received the report hopefully a week ago when we sent it out. We have several of you have written in with some. We weren't requiring that in any sense. Others, I'm sure, brought comments to the meeting, but thanks to those who have also written us and tried in that report to incorporate earlier responses from you, many of them written in reply to a 3 or 4 page call for requests that we sent out. So we've been doing this in an iterative way, trying to build your best advice into each new draft, and we're not done. Our goal is to get that interim report out in the next month or so if you feel it's ready. We don't want to rush it. We think it would be important to have it formally submitted to HSCRC and DHMH, and sooner is probably better, but not too soon, not until you feel that we've reached closure. I know there are a number of members who have significant concerns at this point, and today is going to be the day to raise those issues, see if we can work through them, and really talk about how to move forward and prepare for submitting the application, the plan to CMS, and looking ahead to the second 5 years without risking jeopardizing the achievements that we've made in the first almost 2.5 years. That's always a delicate balance. So I think the first item is to turn it to Donna, who is going to take you through a slide presentation and kind of then segue back to me to facilitate the discussion. We'll, after she's through, we'll spend the first hour or so on the report and focus on your key concerns and how to resolve them, and then the second hour plus on progression and sequencing and what's first priority, what's second, and so on. And then, of course, as always, leave some time for comments from our guests who are joining us today. So, Donna, I'll have you lead off.
All right. Thank you. The purpose of what I'm going to do is to try to begin to tee up what might be in the strategic plan that we need to put together for CMS on by January 1, and the types of strategies that might be in a strategic plan so that we can begin to discuss what are those strategies, and is this the right timeline, what comes first, what comes second, some of the things that you've raised as questions about milestones of how would we actually develop models and approaches as we move beyond this period of time and past a January 1 time frame. And we do that in kind of in the frame. And by the way, I have sent this PowerPoint out to you. I sent it to the wrong email address on Friday, so I apologize that you didn't get it before the weekend, but it was an wrong email address on my part, so sorry about that. But we're doing this in a national landscape that is developing, and with CMS marching down a very clear and deliberate national strategy, although I think that some of you feel that the national strategy results in alphabet soup of the week. It is definitely according to a clear focus on trying to change the way providers are paid, and moving away from volume-based models and moving proven models to scale, changing the delivery of care with a focus on integration and coordination of care and patient engagement, and trying to capitalize on the tremendously large investment that's been made in the electronic medical records and transparency of information for the purpose of engaging consumers and giving consumers better information to work with. And I'm showing you a slide that comes directly from a CMS presentation. Again, you'll have this in hard copy, but this is how they took the grid that we just looked at, and they have filled in all of their initiatives about all of the things that they're testing in terms of alternative payment models, different ways to pay providers, to deliver care, and to distribute information. And our Maryland model is under the title, the second box from the bottom under Deliver Care, under the Maryland all-payer model. And we are now seeing it in the slide presentations from CMS. So we're talking about what we're doing in Maryland in light of what is going on in the national context. And I'm not going to delve deeply into these slides, but just to recap the core things that we have talked about in our previous meetings is that as we drive forward in the process, that we're focused on a person-centered approach that is tailored based on the needs of patients, and with a focus on delivering the right level of care based on that patient's needs. And in terms of the things that we've talked about in multiple work groups and in multiple forums, organizing our thoughts around care delivery and health information exchange and provider alignment, some of the things that have come into the Maryland planning are very similar to what we might see on the CMS chart, but some things are a bit different. But certainly the real focus on care coordination and focusing on the patients with high needs and chronic conditions have been a common discussion at many, many meetings that we've been at together. And capitalizing on the health information exchange that is really much further advanced than other states, the CRISP asset, as well as the multi-billion-dollar investment in electronic health records that has been made in Maryland. I don't know the exact number, but my estimate is something north of $2 billion. Then going back to the very beginning of the advisory council of focusing on how can we bring providers into alignment, and with the focus of building on existing models, like building on the GBR and ACOs and medical home models that we've already begun in the state. And a last item on the list of leveraging opportunities that can be driven across all payers so that we can bring transformation of the delivery system and so that we can begin to attack the hassle factor for doctors and other providers, and the hassle factor for patients. So even if we might be working on a model for a particular purpose, that we're thinking about that in the context of the whole delivery system transformation that needs to take place. This is a slide that has been shown 100 times, and so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just kind of recapping where we've been focused on trying to work with the delivery system as we move forward with our initial year focused on getting hospitals into a payment transformation with the global budget and adapting our policies. The year 2 and 3 beginning to work on planning improvements and planning care coordination approaches, implementing infrastructure, and developing partnerships, and beginning the planning of alignment and alignment development, with a real focus that we're needing in years 4 and 5 of implementation, of some of those approaches of care coordination and complex care and chronic care improvement, continuing to focus on alignment of models and taking the recommendations of our consumer advisors in stepping up our efforts to engage patients and families, and of course what we're focused on doing now, which is planning for the model extension and beginning the process of extending the model past the walls of the hospital. So that's been the plan that we've been working on for this 5-year period. With the language that we've looked at before in other meetings of where it is we're headed prior to the end of the year, to submit a proposal that will limit the Medicare beneficiary total cost of care growth rate to take effect no later than the beginning of 2019. So that is the process that we're engaged in here now, and as we have gotten into the process of implementation and of assessing the Maryland situation, we think that we need to call what we're doing a strategic plan rather than a single model, because right now while we have a hospital model, and we've been at that since 1977, and we kind of know how to run a hospital model, and we can execute on a hospital model. We don't know of the perfect answer for the remainder of the delivery system changes. So I think what we've heard is that people might like to try more than one thing, and maybe one thing will work in one part of Maryland and something else might work in another part of Maryland. And so we're not ready to declare that we know what that one thing is. So we're focused on a strategic plan that will lay out progressions and a timeline of Maryland innovations that would take on increased accountability over time. So what we want to focus on with this advisory council is that strategic plan, and we've been talking about some high-level concepts, which is that we want to maintain the all-payer hospital model, but as we begin to step forward, we really want to focus some of our work around the Medicare beneficiaries that will help us move forward in meeting the terms of our agreement that say that we're going to focus on the Medicare total cost of care. But we want to make sure that we're not just talking about cost, but we're talking about improving the care and outcomes for those beneficiaries. And really starting with Medicare, but maintaining a commitment to all payer principles, so that as we focus on how to develop things, that they can be utilized across the system, so that we're promoting the concept of standardization to the extent that it makes sense, to reduce the hassle factor, to improve the ability of the system to transform. And we have started talking through in the previous meetings some of the potential concepts for a strategic plan. The fact that we already have 56% of Medicare payments under the hospital model. So we're already taking responsibility for that much of the cost, and that we already have a guardrail in place that has a total cost of care test in it, and so that guardrail is already beginning to focus us beyond the walls of the hospital. We have some concepts that we've talked about in this meeting. These are very general, and hopefully as we continue these meetings, we'll drive more specifically into the details of these concepts. But I think one of the things that came out very clearly that I found very valuable from the meetings as a concept is that at the top of the list, that as we test new things, that we should make sure to attach them to our model in a way so that they could be removed if they don't work without crashing the whole system. So if we've got something that's working and we add something that doesn't work, we should eliminate the thing that doesn't work as opposed to risking the entire model. So that things should be able to be attached as separate demonstrations or amendments, but that they can be detached as well. The idea that we want to step into a system, not step off of a cliff, but that we need to begin to develop our capabilities over a period of time. With the very important focus on using common measures across the system, so that we can, one of the areas of alignment is to utilize measures across the system, meaning that if we're asking primary care doctors to be responsible for diabetes control, that we also hold hospital providers responsible for the same thing. So everyone will be focusing on producing the outcomes that will help each other take care of the patients better and also share in financial benefits that might come from better patient care. Over time, to add two-sided models, meaning upside and downside risk, and I also refer to something which we'll have future discussions about, but not a lot today, of something called a soft cap. So our system now for our hospitals, I would call it a soft cap because it is a rolling test, and we don't pay out cash at the end of the year. We keep rolling aggregate tests, so it's not a hard cap, it's a soft cap like our current all-payer model. And so there are other types of ways to put value into the system besides hard payments and hard caps. There are soft caps and value-based modifiers, et cetera. That we need to pay particular attention to MACRA as we work our way through this process, which is new and has a very significant impact on our physician colleagues, and that we focus on adding provider responsibility under agreed approaches. For example, we've started talking about how would post-acute and long-term care be, what kind of a model would make sense for post-acute and long-term care? Is there a payment reform that could be put into place? The dual eligible work group has been busy talking about ways to bring dual eligibles into the equation. And there have been a number of discussions in work groups about expanding medical home models to not just to Medicare, but really to all payers in addition to those who already have medical home models. And again, the common outcomes measures across payers to the extent possible to help drive transformation and to reduce the hassle factor. The slide that we started to look at, and I think someone said that it looked very simple, but behind it was an awful lot of complexity, are some of the potential models to begin to look at to take on the longer term focus of for Medicare and potentially others ultimately, but for Medicare initially, of looking at the total cost of care and care across the delivery system. And just to get a little bit more tangible about, well, what do you mean? How can you get focused on total cost of care? And so what we're talking about in terms of beginning that process is not, we're not at a stage where we're taking on full responsibility at this point, but we are at a stage where we can start receiving more data, more total cost of care data, and data to support care coordination and chronic care improvement. And the delivery system can learn how to utilize that data, and we can focus on improving care and controlling costs by focusing on things that we've talked about in this advisory council, a medical home approach that cuts across payers and models, and that includes a long-term care setting. There's medical home models that need to be utilized in the dual eligible models. Not all of them are primary care. We also have other types of medical home models with different patient populations. Again, with the same emphasis of focusing on patients with high needs and chronic conditions, and also looking at the episodes of care and outcomes, including post-acute. And across the top of this model, I have some numbers with question marks. That's because today we have about 200,000 beneficiaries in ACOs out of about 800,000 fee-for-service beneficiaries, a little bit more than that actually, who are not in a managed care product. So that 800 minus 200 leaves 600,000 beneficiaries, and so how are we going to get started to focus on those beneficiaries? And so that'll be part of the conversation, hopefully, that we'll tee up in the strategic plan. Will it be the ACO, or will it be a medical home model? We have the duals model on here in terms of to be determined, how it combines or is separate from the other models here, and then a geographic model that is based off of the concept of the global budget. So we're not suggesting that this is the right distribution of beneficiaries, but that we have to come up with a model that adds up to 800,000 people in order to have everyone having their total cost of care and their outcomes being focused on. So as we start through the process of, well, how do we begin, how do we progress on this journey that we've already started, the things that we're working on right now, we're working on a care redesign amendment, which we've talked a little bit about before, but I'm going to try to tee up a little bit more about that in a minute. We're working on the strategic plan for CMS, and Now we have another model that CMS has just put out called the CPC Plus model, which Jack is going to talk a little bit about in a few minutes. And in 2017, what we have laid out in this timeline for discussion, again, not at all baked, but what would we be doing in 2017? We would be implementing the Care Redesign Amendment. If we move forward with the CPC Plus model, that would be being implemented. And we may be developing a custom medical home model. We think we would be conceptualizing the geographic model and then continuing to focus on MACRA approaches and post-acute model approaches. In the design timeline that we've laid out here in 2018, we would be implementing a custom medical home model, phase 1 of a duals model, and we're calling that on this sheet of paper care coordination. That's just talking. It's not we're not done with the duals planning process yet. We would be preparing, doing more work in preparation for MACRA, and we would hopefully be working on developing a post-acute model for approval and preparation for implementation, and I would call that long-term and post-acute model. We'd also be focusing on a geographic model and a CMS clearance process. That's part of how we get these models to the finish line with CMS. And then in 2019, we begin test driving this, although we've been test driving all along total cost of care, because we'll go back to it in a minute. We will have gotten data in 2017 to allow us to begin to develop some skills with our total cost of care. We would test drive these models together and also implement the post-acute model. And I have a state specific with a question mark here. If we're going to have state goals, do we need to calculate our own benchmarks inside of the state to administer a model? So that's a question that doesn't necessarily have to be answered, but it's one that may come up in our strategic planning process. And then beyond 2019, we begin to focus on how we will progress to take on more responsibility over time. So that's just some very general thought process of what might be in a strategic plan and for ongoing discussion. And in terms of the Care Redesign Amendment as an intermediate step, in response to the stakeholder input, we have been working on an amendment to the all-payer model. And at the conclusion of the amendment, we would expect to get data, for hospitals to get data, and ultimately to allow them to focus on interventions and get approvals, safe harbor approvals, et cetera, to work on interventions with partners. And that model has been conceptualized as a living model so that we can change it every year. We don't have to go back to CMS every time we want to change part of it or add a new set of providers, as long as we're changing it within the intent and within the activities that have been approved by CMS under that redesign amendment. And I don't want to take up all of the discussion on that today, but basically the hope is that we will, we've been working on it for a while, that by the summer, fall, that we would have hospitals submitting a letter of intent for care redesign, similar to what you would do with any other CMS model. In the fall or the fall, that you would sign a participation agreement with CMS, and that we would be able to have comprehensive identifiable data that can be used for care coordination in accordance with appropriate use requirements for care coordination. With that, hospitals would have the information that they would need to, we would call it launch the care redesign activities with that more detailed data on January 1 of 17 under the model. And in post this initial implementation, that there would be a second track that could be initiated at the again, the track 2, we have track 1, which is continuing care redesign activities, and track 2 is also having shared savings pools. So that would be really an individual decision about which tracks to utilize, and it might depend on the particular situation of the delivery system. So that is a very rapid fire through what might ultimately begin to be formulated in the plan. And I know that we're going to get into the CPC Plus discussion. Are you going to do that after the
What
draft?
I do is, when you're ready, I'd say a word or two about it, but more as a segue, picking up on it, because Shuli explained it in some detail, I think, at the last meeting very well. So I thought I'd say a couple words, then bridge that and segue. Is that okay?
Yes.
Were you done?
Yes.
Okay.
So, although I could ask if there are questions before we move on to Jack. So I know that was kind of a rapid fire walkthrough.
I have two questions, or just simple questions. Track 1 and track 2 are the same terms that are in NAPLA and the alternative payment. Would you mind changing that to maybe track 1A and B?
Yes.
Just for the sake of clarity?
Yes. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you. Then the other thought was, and I need some feedback on this. Physicians are supposed to be moving straight into the alternative payment systems, and or if they don't, I think our payments are going to be impacted in 2017. And I think that is it 18? Okay, that's where I needed the input. I thought it was 17.
No, you have to be signed up by 17, but your payments aren't affected until 19.
Okay.
So you were kind of right.
Then never mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, but you got the dates right, and we were a little hazy, but we were correct on our dates at the last meeting that we said 2017 is the date to be in for 2019. If you go in 2018, then you're in the 2020. So it's not like you have one chance and then you miss the bandwagon forever. It's just right now it's a 2-year lag between the time you start an alternative payment model and when you get the fee bonus.
I just wanted to make sure that we were in the same timeline and time frame, and you clarified that. Thank you. That's my other question.
And this care redesign amendment is not presently set up as a risk model, so I don't want you to think that it is now sitting as a risk model. And that what is happening in 17 right now is getting data to start care redesign. It isn't actually a payment model at that point that have a specific date on here for post-initiation. I think it will partly depend on the timeline that the providers want to drive forward, but it could be 2018. It could be wrapped around to help support macro requirements. So it's been contemplated from the very beginning that we would work on this model to help it fit into the macro world.
Yeah, I guess that was the point I was going to hit was, we had our population health meeting, national meeting on Saturday, and the main concern in terms of aligning physicians with new models was how are we going to meet these requirements, because the data already indicates that the vast majority of physicians will not meet the MIPS or the ACM requirements, and to a greater extent the MIPS requirement. To a certain extent, the whole idea behind the financial situation with that whole program is that physicians won't meet it, and that's how they're going to meet the cost. The losers are going to pay the winners, let's say, something like that. So to the extent that the all-payer model can help physicians meet those requirements, that's going to be a great aligning force. I think the American Hospital Association was at a hearing in the U.S. House of Representatives, and they said the same thing, but particularly with hospital-based physicians, that they want to see the macro legislation allow for the hospitals to help with the reporting requirements that are necessary and other requirements that are necessary under the macro legislation, particularly with the MIPS. Most of the providers will fit under that category to a greater extent. Although if the all-payer model can allow development of these alternative payment models, that's even a greater aligning force, because potentially the upside potential could be even better with those. But then we have to, I think, get into the issue of the risk, and I think Chet brought up the risk and who's going to take on those risks at the last meeting, and that's more unclear how, because I don't think with the degree of risk that is out there, I believe it's 30%, or that's the nominal risk that they're talking about, that a provider could directly take that on. But if there's a different structure that could allow the model that we have here help providers meet the requirements in MIPS and in macro, and certainly with the CPC Plus, I think that's tremendous for the primary care providers, and I think that would really serve to align the provider community. And I think that's what CMS is looking for in a report. How do you align the provider community with this model?
Thank you. And I think we have that in the timeline here as a continuing important conversation. The amendment has a total cost of care guardrail that doesn't create risk. On the other hand, it could be used to potentially create models that would qualify as an alternative payment model potentially. Similar to the way the CPC Plus is, it is not a 30% risk. It's $2 PMPM on the CPC Plus model, track 1. That is not a 30% risk model. It's about, I think it's about $6,000 for a primary care physician, and for that you get a 5% fee schedule increase. So it actually looks like a pretty attractive approach. So we do have some potential tools in Maryland that might not be available in other states, because we already have a model that has 56% of the cost at risk in the model under our Maryland all-payer model. There may be unique approaches that could be developed, but they have to be developed with the physicians driving driving that process with us, as opposed to us creating them. So, but there are other opportunities in Maryland that aren't available elsewhere. And I think Bruce Vladeck said you should go negotiate those opportunities with CMS. So that's really, those are, you know, that's why they're on that planning timeline of things to do that are important. Carmela,
I think you've got a whole host of books. Can I just pick up on MACRA, and maybe it's illustrative. MACRA is sort of the new entrant, maybe the wrench that's in all of this. That is, we had been pursuing gain-sharing opportunities with physicians in the 2 programs now in front of CMS, but now that's been superseded to a certain extent by this new MACRA, not the legislation, but the proposed regulations that are out. But a little bit along Dr. Willarda and Dr. Paravenda's question, could you talk about how you see that unfolding? On slide 15, I was just looking at the slide 15, so that the timeline. Do you see the HFCRC coming up with models? It was sort of where you just left off, Donna. Do you see the physician communities coming up with models? Do you see this as part of the Maryland all-payer system? Will this be separate? How do you see the connection between Maryland physicians meeting MACRA requirements and the work that we're engaged in?
I think it's part of the strategic plan that needs to be laid out, and so it's here as a clear part of the strategic plan. We have to say who and how and what as we work our way through the strategic plan. The models that we already started working on, in theory, could be tweaked to begin to similar to the CPC Plus, which prepays a bonus and then claws it back if you don't actually get the job done. You could take the internal cost-sharing model for hospital-based physicians, and I'm not saying you want to do this, but you could prepay and claw back if they don't get the job done. So I'm saying that we probably have, you know, different options here in Maryland, and when you all were, when the CHI and the Hospital Association, we were sitting at the table working on these amendments to get them ready to go in, you said, hey, let's try to make sure that we tee this up so that it can be, we don't know what MACRA is going to look like, but let's try to get this framed up so that we could come back and adjust it to make it work with MACRA. So it doesn't work right this second, but it is, if we get our approvals in place, we could do a similar thing as CPC is doing, which is pay and claw back. So that, you know, that is a possible solution. I'm not saying that that is the right solution, but I'm just saying that there are other options. Does that make sense, Carmela? Jean?
I would ask if it's possible, when we do this little discussion on CPC Plus, can we have Chet talk about his program that my guys are getting lots of letters on, and how that fits in and how that works, just so I can understand that better. We can all see how that works within the context of all this stuff. Can we give him 5 minutes? Or I didn't ask you this, but I would like to understand it better so it fits in.
Yeah, so, well, we'll do just a couple more quick questions and then on to the CPC Plus, if that's all right. Peggy?
Thank you. First, thank you for this document, because this is the roadmap that we've been talking about in the strategic plan from earlier discussions. But I've made an assumption, and I want to make sure that my assumption is correct, because we're using all-payer versus the Medicare model simultaneously in this document. Is this designed, when you go to the potential items in the strategic plan, high-level timelines for discussion, 2016, 2017, you talk about the various models. Is this for the all-payer component, or is this Medicare only?
The care redesign amendment is all-payer. The strategic plan is focused on Medicare total cost of care, but hopefully as we go through the strategic planning process, we will agree that it would be desirable to align outcomes approaches across all payers, even if we're really focused on the total cost of care and really meeting the requirements on Medicare, who is Medicare patients who really don't have the same supports in Maryland that some of the other patients have under managed care plans or under other models, but that we're focused on driving system transformation on an all-payer basis, but focusing on total cost of care for Medicare under the requirements, and then Medicaid is also focused on driving forward a discussion on the dual eligible. So, and so that is also mentioned in here. Does that begin to clarify? And one of the things that, and I'll jump straight to the end, the last slide in the deck, and then we'll go back into the, not the last slide, it's actually the slide, where is my next step slide? Well, anyway, the next step. So one of the things that we have really been talking about is of asking the advisory council to come back and meet every month until the first of the year so that you can work with us as we develop the strategic plan, and we can put the meat on the bones and with you, and that you can provide input as we develop the strategic plan so that it will be hopefully become clearer and clearer as we put words on paper in a strategic planning document about what exactly does that mean, and be able to put that back in front of you. David?
This may reflect an outsider's lack of familiarity, but how would you say this report relates to the strategic plan that you're developing?
The 2017 amendment?
What we read for today, the interim draft report. So is what we read, you distributed and we read for today, meant to support the plan you just shared with us, or is it is that what you would like this report to do?
I think originally our focus was on you giving us advice on what we should be thinking about when we develop the strategic plan. And so that's what we still want from the interim report is the advice, and we'd like to share that advice with other folks. But at the same time, there's a lot of angst about getting the plan on and making sure that folks are in tune with what's in the plan. And we actually want to avoid a process where we grind down to the 11th hour and have the stakeholders upset because they didn't know what was in the plan. So we believe that this will be a better way to actually create the plan with creating an outline of the plan and then filling it in with more details so that by the time it's ready to be submitted, that people will have actually contributed to it and been a part of making it, and hopefully that we'll get through the noisy part of the process as we bake the cake and not at the end when we're trying to submit to CMS. So that's at least the hope, the aspiration that we would have with the process. Does that make sense? So advice for the plan. Now we work on the plan together and we have it ready to submit the strategic plan at the end of the year, and everybody gets to see it as it's being produced.
These are the principles that guide the development plan.
Yes. So what's in the report are the beginnings of the advice from the advisory council on what we should be doing as we develop the plan. And so we've started to try to take some of those things into account in this presentation today.
I think
there are,
Yes, thank you, Donna. Thanks very much for the presentation. It's really very helpful. And in terms of the shift, I would say in approach, moving away from submitting a clear model at the end of the year and going with a strategic plan, I think makes a lot of sense because of the amount of uncertainty that we've all talked about in this room. So it provides a lot of opportunity to adjust along the way. Maybe just two specific comments on the presentation or on some of the discussion that we've had here. You made the comment on one of the slides about, and I think it was slide 14, where you laid out kind of for the first time how many beneficiaries are in the different buckets on the Medicare side. I think that was very helpful to see. You made the comment that we really need to get everybody into a total cost of care mindset. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think you can get to a critical mass at some point, and maybe that's part of the discussion. I mean, so long as beneficiaries are distributed relatively equally, I'll say, from a risk perspective into the different buckets, there's a number, and I'm not going to pick a number today, but arguably, 80 or 90%. If you get 80 or 90% into a system where you're managing some aspect of their care, you're going to have some success. And so I would just hope that we're not trying to get all 800,000, that we can focus on whatever that smaller number is. And then the second point, it came up in the conversation about MACRA, gain sharing, risk assumption. I think it gets at some issues that Chet has raised on the accountability front. And probably we have to wrap our hands as an advisory council around this. There is no free lunch. And so for anybody on the non-hospital side of the table who's thinking that hospitals will just fund whatever it is and take all the downside risk but share the upside gain, to me, I think that would be a mistake. I think people have to have skin in the game. And that's not just from me saying that, but that is CMS's thought process. I mean, that's why they've come up with, how they've structured MACRA. Is that they want people to actually have some skin in the game. So I don't know how we address that as a group, but I would hate for people around the table to go away thinking, okay, we can solve MACRA, and I don't actually have to take risk on my physician fees. And by the way, that's a thing that we face as a health system as well. And we employ 1,800 physicians, and we're grappling with that very issue ourselves, is how do we get our own physicians qualified for MACRA and minimize how much incremental risk that we take on in that process. So I would think that our interests are aligned in many ways on that issue. But we're certainly not looking at it from a perspective that there's going to be some free ride on this. There's going to have to be some actual risk assumption along the way. And I do think it ties back to what Chet has talked about a number of times on the accountability.
yeah, I mean, if you end up looking at the, when we start looking more at the amendment, even in the original form, the way it was being written is, unless we were actually able to produce on the total cost of care, staying within, not growing past the national growth rate, that there wasn't a savings to share. So we actually had to be producing in order to be able to share savings. But then the same thing, the same thought process applies, that you actually, in order to get your full pay, you have to be producing get your full potential. You have to be producing under whatever model has been put out there. So you're absolutely right that we actually have to be producing in order to be able to drive these things forward.
I just want to clarify that I didn't mean that the providers should take no risk. I think that, like the CPC Plus, the risk is developed in such a fashion as there's upfront payments and then that's taken away. That might be a way to structure the risk such that, a small provider group can take on that risk. So there's a different way to structure the risk, potentially for smaller
there could be multiple ways, so I think they bear a lot of discussion. But we should have some, being as far advanced as we are, we should have some options and be able to build on them that aren't available elsewhere. And we need everybody working a little bit harder maybe than everybody else does elsewhere too. So that would be Gary.
Yeah, as I look on, the page 10 and the concept about, what the intent is, obviously I think there's an alignment agreement that 56%, as you say, is pretty much defined on, what the model on that side looks like. The 44% is hanging out there. And I don't still see enough, as back to Chet's point, what's in the 44? What's in the major categories? I think that needs to be lined out. And then when those categories go over, what happens? I just don't see enough about that. Today, like Eric said, when there's a shortfall in the 56, the hospital's pretty much got it. What happens on the 44? And what are the interplays between those components? I don't see that enough yet on what happens.
Right. I think that's the part of the strategic planning process, but also part of the I'll call it the experimental design, is that we're focusing on how to align the system with new models around controlling the total cost of care. But the system is already focused on how to begin to implement and execute on controlling the total cost of care through focusing on care coordination, on complex and chronic care, and implementing those designs are part of the process of delivering on the total cost of care. So we certainly need to go into it in more detail as we walk through the planning process.
There's another question, and I'm going to pick up where Gary is. I think we're supposed to turn this thing on. I don't know. If I could just pick up on that, I think maybe the question is, if we submit something, what is CMS's expectation? I don't want to put words in your mouth, Gary, but if we were to submit a strategic plan, does that mean that CMS, do you believe CMS ultimately expects us to deliver on that plan? And I'm looking at slide 15. It's the timeline, which just seems, there's a lot. There's a lot on that slide. It almost seems like we need to chase down the physician path a bit to understand where it may go, chase down the post-acute care path a bit to see where it may go, to see if these pieces ultimately fit together. Or do you believe that something could be submitted that we later, in a strategic planning process, say, I guess that's not going to work? What are we going to be held accountable for, I guess, in terms of a plan?
Well, I think at a minimum we can look back at what we filed the last time, which I would describe as a pretty high-level strategic plan. And in the end, there were certain things that were very specific that were negotiated between the state and CMS, but in many respects, the document that was filed laid out a strategic plan that set out the state's objectives for a patient-centered focus around a community integrated medical home model, and there were a series of initiatives that were laid out in that model at that point in time. So, and there was very little detail about exactly how it would be executed. There were goals in that plan. So, in some respects, we actually are further along in some ways because we've already developed a number of things and we're already in action. So some of the things that we're trying now are things that we could add into what we're doing. Some of them may be completely new, but others, I think Chet described a series of approaches that could be molded together, and figuring out how to do that as opposed to necessarily starting over from scratch to develop something anew. So, that would be one approach, is to look at what we did before. The other is to begin, as we develop, to have more discussions with CMS as we develop the plan. And of course, being that we're in public, we know that they're always in the meetings with us. So the unique approach of the public process. Yes.
I add to this conversation.
Sure.
Picking up, starting with Eric, going to Gary, and Carmela. As I said in the first meeting, I think this issue of accountability wonderfully focuses attention. So let me draw the distinction this way. If a hospital-centric approach or a hospital-aligned approach with physicians, both physicians that are employed and physicians in the community, or one approach, the question becomes, what is the hospital that's at the center accountable for? Are they accountable for a whole population that they serve, some of whom don't necessarily go to that hospital? Are they responsible for a geographic area? I.e., I think I used the example Holy Cross in Montgomery County. Are they responsible for everything on Montgomery County? That's one way to define accountability. But we know in our own data that people scatter all over the place and that they really can't be held accountable that way. Okay, so then how are they accountable? That's one dilemma. Another dilemma is, if you think, we'll say there's just physicians involved as another model, and they take on the accountability for global cost, but then don't get it done. Who takes accountability for that? The hospitals? Well, that doesn't seem fair. So the hospital takes a rate cut because some other party didn't deliver. So that's another dilemma on accountability. It's one thing to say you have a plan, a strategic plan, but if what CMS is actually looking for is a concrete model by which you're going to carry out that plan. I have a plan to get to the moon. I know I need rocket boosters. I know I need a guidance system. I know I need a number of things. My plan is to get those things, but I don't have any of them, and I haven't specified any of them. It's questionable how much of a plan you really have. So how does one crystallize the way accountability is structured and for whom? Right now, the HSCRC has power over hospital rates on all these other factors. Not that it couldn't get it, I suppose, but it doesn't presently. The only instrument available to say that when the system doesn't perform is to limit hospital reimbursement. It seems to me that's a prescription for constant tension and ill will. So, I don't think anything new. I'm just trying to say perhaps the obvious. Until and unless there is a clear understanding of who is accountable and what they're accountable for, you can't necessarily describe a model. And if you can't describe a model, I would question what CMS thinks it's got in front of it. And so, I don't know if I'm saying what Carly.
Well said.
I don't want to speak for everybody else. I'm just trying to articulate what I think.
No, I think that we don't have to solve the dilemma today. We have another 6 months before we file a plan. So I think we need to work through some of the issues in a little bit more detail On the other hand, and, I would say that our accountability model is already more robust than the accountable care organizations throughout the United States. So we already have more accountability with 56% that we're accountable for on a fixed basis. And we already have a guardrail, which no MSSP in the country has, of 1% and 0%. So we already have a lot of accountability in Maryland, and I don't want to lose track of that already. Now we need a more effective way of executing with the accountability that we already have on one hand. And so hopefully that can be part of what we can discuss and tee up over the next few months and start that process through.
If a lot of what the work effort involves, one way or the other, is how you define what the challenge is, or the problem is, or the dilemma is. If the plan is to focus in on those kinds of issues, not for clarity today, but for clarity by the time it is filed, then that's a plan. And the result of that plan, the findings of that plan, the conclusions of that plan, I would think would be expressed in what is filed. But if those dilemmas, those accountability questions are not defined as the things that are sensitive, then we'll wind up with a lot of other stuff around it and not, I think, have dealt with the core issue of how do you fix this accountability. And just one other thought, I don't mean to go on. If there are going to be a variety of approaches, sometimes with hospital alignment, sometimes not, and they're supposed to all dovetail together towards a coherent overall target, which is you cannot exceed Medicare rate of spend. How do they dovetail together and not clash with each other? And so I think there are these 3 or 4 key questions that could guide the work or could guide the thinking. And I think from, just one advisory council member, but if that's what the commission wanted to focus on, is some additional work to clarify those questions, we're all in. And what our concern would be, if that's not what you focus on, then the plan itself doesn't necessarily lead to one or more models that will actually live within the very tight standards that you have to live with in order to keep the waiver. I've said enough.
Although, can I grab on to that? And it's a broader comment, Jack. I'm sure we'll get to the paper. But I do worry, Chet, exactly to your point, that we shouldn't be chasing a deadline. We should be chasing an objective. And I know CMS is often here or listening, but there shouldn't be any question that we are all working hard on this. We've got leaders around this table who devoted hours and hours, a great rate-setting commission devoted years to making this happen. But I guess what I'm hearing is it's very difficult to create buy-in for a strategic plan unless and until we understand the pieces and how those pieces would fit together to understand if that plan is taking us to our destination. And I'm concerned that we are fixated on December 31st of this year when we should be fixated on the approach that will get this right, and an approach that we can do well, and an approach that we can deliver on as the state of Maryland. And perhaps then there is a conversation with CMS that needs to be had to talk about this. I don't think anybody's saying stop, but we're saying we need to work this through, and this is difficult work to get right. I'd rather see us do what we need to do to get it right, to have a plan, Donna, as you're describing, and one that everybody around this table can believe in and thinks that we can actually deliver on.
Okay, then maybe we'll segue, give you the last comment unless anybody's good, and then we'll segue into the report.
So I've been trying to understand a little bit about what we're doing and how we went from a model, coming up with a model, coming up with a strategic plan. And one way of interpreting that would be to say it's really, really hard to change the healthcare system. And until the state of Maryland has a series of requirements that is carrying with it, with accountability to CMS, it's going to be hard to get the interests aligned that need to align to agree on a model that's very different from the way it works right now. Now, that model in the hospital sector is well defined, but it's not like, it may not be stable if you're really going to manage total cost of care. So one way of thinking about this is, let's get a plan approved by CMS, and then once that plan is approved, everyone will know they've got to come to the table. But we won't get people to come to the table until we have the plan. Now, that may not be at all what's on your mind, but I've been trying to make sense of what we're doing right now, and that's one way I'm trying to make sense of it. If I'm completely wrong about that, let me just say one other thing. Carmela, maybe people in Maryland are different, but everywhere else I've worked in my career, having deadlines has been essential to get anything hard done. And as long as you have something really hard to do when you have no deadline, you can keep pushing out the hard choices. And there are hard choices sitting in front of us right now. So I think you can, getting back to my original fantasy about what's going on, the problem with postponing the plan, the model, is that you've got all this other stuff happening that is narrowing your choices. You're going to have people making an adaptation to MACRA, making an adaptation to the primary care model, making bets, putting money into change models. And then you're going to come back a year and a half to 2 years from now and try to unearth all that or make sense of it. And I think that's just something where you need some breathing space. And whether you can get that from CMS, I don't know. But if your goal is to get to the waiver with all your options open in terms of what follows, the world is going to constrain those options because of the choices that physicians have to make in order to assure their future. So I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that the time is not necessarily on your side in terms of coming up with a model that works.
And I don't know necessarily if, at least the way we're laying it out is, I think what we've heard advice is to not think that there's just one model, that we should test several models. And so that's the notion of not saying that we're going to submit a model, is that if we knew exactly what was going to work, we'd all be not sitting in this room, because we'd all be making the big bucks, because we would have figured it out, no one else would have. But so I think what we're saying is, hey, we haven't, CMS hasn't come up with the silver bullet yet for the non-hospital piece, and we need to work on that. Just as CMS is working on it, we need to test some things, but we need to test them in a way that fits in with the Maryland situation, with the goals that Maryland sets out, which is a goal of trying to focus on doing all payer approaches to the maximum extent possible. CMS is also driving in that direction with payers around the country, of trying to get them to standardize metrics so that to reduce the hassle factor for the providers, to reduce the hassle factor for the patients. And so there are some things that CMS is doing that will fit in very well with the direction that Maryland is taking. There are other things that maybe not so much, and so we have to figure out what those are. And already the hospitals and the physicians and the nursing homes already submitted a joint comment letter on bundled payments. And so there are some things that they've said, hey, wait, we're not ready for that. It's not time yet to do that in our model. So I think that's part of what the issue is, that we don't think that we know what the silver bullet is at this point in time, and it may not be the same in Cumberland, Maryland, or in Salisbury, Maryland, as it is in Baltimore City. On the very back of actually the last slide, I mean, one of the things that we do have in our eyesight, and sorry for some overlapping text on this slide, but in terms of the Medicare services, if we have 55% of the services at the hospital, we have another 12% of the services that are directly related to the hospital being post-acute, and probably about 8% of those services are for providers practicing at the hospital. So we actually, by focusing on things that surround the hospital, we have about 75% of the cost within bullseye of the hospital and what surrounds the hospital. And on the other side of the equation, hopefully we'll really work hard and come up with something that makes a lot of sense for our primary care and chronic care colleagues. And, that really starts to get into the other side of that cost equation. And so, those are some of the conversations that we need to tee up and look at closely, and really the focuses of why we're really interested in the post-acute provider, because that brings another 12% into the model, and some of the other things that we're talking about with working with the hospital providers and the primary care and other chronic care providers really starts to gain a considerable piece of the action in terms of total cost and outcomes. So I don't know if that demystifies it. Did we want to have Chet talk about CPC Plus before we dive into the report, or did you want to get into the report first?
I can do it either way. I was thinking that I would segue into it and then start with Chet. But thank you. I'm going to try to do that briefly because A, it's a good thing to do, and B, I recently got a voice from the past. And you're probably wondering, why is it our facilitator listening to voices? But I got more than a voice, actually. My sister, I was visiting her recently in Ohio, and she found a couple of my grade cards from elementary and secondary school, and I brought one with me from my 7th grade geography teacher. And this is what he said in the first comment period. I'm going to have Howard verify this. That talks a little too much. Verified by my friend Howard. So even from back in the 7th grade, this is a long stand note. We've been working on it for several years. So I have to be careful for that reason, and also because there's a lot of wisdom around this table. So the less you hear from me, the better. And the other thing I want to restate, I hopefully said in earlier meetings, when you do hear from me, it's me trying to interpret you. If you want to know how I think about something, we'll have coffee. My personal views. But what I'm trying to do in these iterations of drafts, not always successfully, is capture your thoughts and weave them together. And what we're going to do in the future of this meeting is to have you say, and I already know there's some considerable concerns about this last draft. We're going to get that on the table, and we're going to try to work it through. So that's part of my job, working with Donna and her staff and my colleagues to try to capture your thinking. So I'm going to be real brief about CPC Plus because Shuli had a good presentation at the last meeting. I'm just going to tell you what I think I sense 3 essential differences are between tracks 1 and 2, as I gleaned from reading their materials. The first difference is I think CMS expects physicians in the track 2 will be providing, this is their own words, more comprehensive services for patients with complex and medical and behavioral needs, and a systematic assessment of their psychosocial needs, and an inventory of resources and support to build those needs. That's going deeper into the most complex patients. I think that's the first thing they expect. That differentiates that track. The second thing I think is that, and Donna touched on this, I think for those who go down the second track, they agree to a lower evaluation and management fee than they would have gotten. Added to that is an upfront bonus payment of sorts, which is at risk for performance. So they take a reduced fee. If they hit the bonus, they'll be better off even with just the old fee. But if they don't, they're going to be more at risk. And finally, the vendors in this world for the Track 2 practices will sign an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with CMS, that outlines their commitments, which have to be adequate to supporting medical practices as they enhance their IT capabilities. So I think those are the three key things. I don't want to get into the weeds of the structure. You know that. The only other one or two points I wanted to make, thinking about my teacher's admonition, is that, you know, my sense is, and I'm going to try to relate this back to Carmela's point, and then, you know, after Chet talks, Carmela and others, to get back to her point about the December 31st and so forth. My sense of your sense of what I've heard so far, and from talking with Donna and other experts around the state, is that there's no going back, and my own experience, there's no going back on what's happening in the environment. So we talk about macro and MIPS and, you know, all these, the geographic model, dealing with the social determinants, now CPC+, and there'll be something, and the Burwell edict of, if you stay in fee-for-service, this is what you have to do by 2016, and this is what you have to do by 2018, and the corresponding one, 30% of providers need to be in alternative payment models by end of 2016, and 50% by the end of 2018. These are coming out, and there are analogous corresponding changes going on among private payers. That includes self-insured employers. That includes major health plans like Care First and United and others. They're innovating all the time. And so if you're a provider, that's going to just keep happening. That genie's not going back in the bottle. However, just underscoring a point that Donna made, that doesn't mean that Maryland, as it rolls out its plan, has to adopt each of these exactly how they're taken. And part of the advice that this group can give is on how you, instead of trying to get the genie back in the bottle and going back to the old days, and not being reactionary and trying to go back to the old days, which are gone, you know, how can we find levers from these new innovative delivery as well as payment systems that will support what we're trying to do under the advanced form of the all-payer model system? And others, you mentioned episodic care bundled payments, haven't gotten much take-up today. ACOs are, David, I think you brought this out the last meeting, that I think you used the term 1.0 in this state, but there's going to be a 2.0 and a 3.0. That, you know, in other states they're already at 2.0 or 3.0, like Vermont. That could happen here, but it doesn't always have to happen in the same place in every state. Now, final point relates to Carmela's point, and after Chet talks on, then we'll get some reactions to what Carmela said and how her colleagues feel, some of which has already been stated by Eric. Put it in. I put it in the paper. By the way, the paper has a lot of direct quotes from you all. And, you know, in the other cases I paraphrased. It's all your thoughts to the extent possible, but I know I didn't capture them just right. It had been my sense that what you were saying was, and I actually was thinking about a comment that Bob closed the last meeting with. I'm paraphrasing, Bob, so if I don't get it just right, you can please correct me. We don't want to lose the all-payer flavor in all this, and we don't want to do something that would jeopardize the federal government saying, we're out of here, and taking their money with them. Okay? That doesn't mean we just roll over and do anything they want, but there's a lot at stake here for Maryland in terms of keeping the feds at the table. What I was interpreting about the December 31st deadline was sort of, for goodness sakes, don't miss it. And it's really kind of what David was saying in a different way, I think. You know, we need, not just because deadlines force us to do things, which you quite actually, it's the same in my life as it is in yours, all the organizations I've worked with, but also that seems to be something that would be a bad idea. I thought I heard you say of getting CMS upset that we're backing away from a deadline that was put in the original agreement. That said, I think what you were all saying to them is, hey, listen, folks, our ability to meet these milestones that we laid out in the plan on time for you depends on you giving us the darn data. And you know, among other things. Also, there are a lot of things that happen in the external environment. So for us to have any chance of meeting the milestones, you're going to have to help us in a number of respects. And you're also going to have to give us the information that you have not given us. We're moving ahead with the information we have, which is a lot, in terms of policy planning, but in terms of operations and implementation, you got to help us. That's what I thought I heard you saying. And also, you know, Donna can lay out with her staff, and they do this beautifully, a great progression model, and we're going to talk about the progression. These are the things we're going to do in 2017, 18, 19, 20, but they may not work out exactly like that. You know, even if CMS does, you know, any more than anything else does, but let's put it out there and try to stick with it. That's what I thought I heard. So I want to, after Chet responds to the response, for a brief overview of the Care First plan.
Can I ask you one quick question?
Yeah.
Does anyone articulate what Maryland is thinking about with CPC Plus? And maybe it's too early to ask the question. I know Ben is having this super secret meeting this morning with all the payers to see what they think about it. Do we have any idea what our thought is on it, or is there no? Don or Steve, what's the plan? What's the thought from the state perspective? And maybe that's why Ben's not here. Maybe they got him.
No, actually, I think we actually said on slide 18 here that you have in front of you is we were trying to tee up a discussion on it because it's a kind of a here and now hot topic of you know, the question, will payers and primary care providers leverage the CPC Plus model? And so that's kind of being driven by payers and providers in their interest and willingness and participating. And then the second question is, should Maryland seek a customized approach? So those were two questions that Jack is supposed to be teeing up today as part of the discussion. So I think you ask Chet to dive into what Care First thinks about that.
I got that. I want to hear what that is. But then we have, my understanding is that we have until we, as in collectively, the world has until June 1st to submit something. So are we planning on doing that? Is there going to be another submission? Are we looking at other folks to do it as well? I guess that's the other question, but maybe that's the discussion.
And the reason that Ben is not here is because he's at the exchange meeting. He has a board meeting, so that's the only reason that he's not here.
No, but I know they had a meeting this morning with the payers on this specific issue.
I mean, basically, there was a call with the payers because there was a call with the payers because the payers are the ones who have to submit interest because it's a multi-payer approach. And so the payers that I'll report that the payers on the phone said that they were thinking about it. So that was the general. I don't know if Gary may have some additional thoughts about it too, but it was we're thinking about it was what we heard on the phone this morning. I was a listener, not a facilitator, but that's what I heard on the phone.
So right now, the only thing we know is that you're obviously doing something, but right now we're not aware of anybody else.
No, I think people are discussing it. They're thinking about it.
We have until June 1st, so, right.
Right. But it has to be multi-payer, so that's the general thought process.
Right. Okay, Ted, you've been called on.
Well, we're at the time of year for us where we announce we're a couple of weeks away, the results of our own PCMH program for 2015. So we have to let run out of claims occur, and then, which we've done, and are now getting very close to announcing. In a nutshell, think of it this way. I think you all know this, but just at the risk of some redundancy, we have about 4,500 primary care physicians in the region in the program. They're organized into about 450 teams. We call medical care panels. The average size of the team is 10. They're all over the place. They're in major academic centers, they're in community hospitals, they're in the community, they're all over. In the last 2 years, the program handled somewhere between $4.5 and $5 billion a year in global cost. So when we think of global on the commercial side, it's what the equivalent is of A and B plus D. It's everything, drug included. Given the escalation in drug prices, it's been very challenging. But our main goal in the program, again, I think as everybody knows, has been to slow the rise in healthcare costs per capita. And we were experiencing 7.5 a year, years on end, 7.5 to 10. And our goal was to take it down by at least half. We've done that. The actual trend over the last 3 years running is in the low 3s. There's never been a time in the history of the company when the trend was that low on a sustained basis. Actuaries always said, well, it's going to pop up again, and it certainly may, but it hasn't so far. We've seen a 15% drop in inpatient use. I don't think the program is completely responsible for that, but we saw it nevertheless. About 2/3 of all of the panels, the teams, win. The way the program works is we take their historical claims, we risk adjust it, and we trend it. And we trend it by a factor in the last 3 years is 3 to 3.5. So we say basically if you take your customized, if you will, your unique pattern of use and cost as a team, and you trend it forward and express it as a global expected cost of care, which includes drug, and you beat it, you can it's aligned. You can keep a piece of the savings. And we give you 12% up front just to do it. Well, the average, the net between the winners and the losers, because some actually have costs that exceed the targets, but the net savings achieved between the winners and the losers, it looks like in 2015, these are not final numbers, is something in the order of 4% net savings after paying for the losers, and after paying for the gas and cost of care coordination, and after paying incentive awards. The average value of that payment to an individual primary rose in 2011 from $11,000 to something approximating $40,000 per primary per year as a result of the savings that they were able to generate. So on the strength of what appeared to be bending the trend pretty materially in the commercial market, I think, again, as everybody knows, we went to CMS 4 years ago and said, well, what if you applied this model to Medicare, A and B? Exactly what we're talking about. And they gave us an innovation award to do that. 14 of our panels out of the 440 or 50 agreed to do it. And they had 40,000 Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries. Common model meant all the rules would be the same. The data would be the same. The incentives would be the same. the supports would be the same. On the thought, it's certainly consistent with everything we talk about here, that if they were the same, it would be easier for the providers and that they would get a better overall result. Well, we're about to finish the reporting on 2015, which is the third year of the innovation grant, third and final. And during that course, Medicare per member per month, per beneficiary per month was flat over 3 years, never went up at all. And there were outcome incentive awards to the individual primaries. Those were limited by the size of the grant, but for the average primary, that was $20,000. And in fact, if it were not limited by the grant, it would have been triple that amount. This is after the cost of care coordination. So we found in both cases that in the commercial case, hospital use went down more than we thought it would. Again, I wouldn't say that the program was entirely responsible. We know that there are other changes and other incentives in the hospital system. Medicare use went down 18%. And so the result of this was, we think, both qualitative improvements as well as cost improvements. So we asked, and the physicians, I would say, that were involved in the effort were very satisfied with the program. Virtually 100% of them said, if you didn't get this to continue, count us in. We said, well, we don't know if we can get it to continue. It's up to CMS. It was done under an innovation award, and that ended, and then we didn't know what would happen next. Lo and behold, what comes out, as we all now know, is CPC Plus. When CPC Plus pays its fees, as you said, for care coordination, if the average was $28 PMPM, that's about 3% of Medicare typical spend for A and B. It turns out that we spent about 3% on care coordination. So we thought, well, it's a reasonable number. So we're where the discussion was this morning, which is we are looking seriously into whether CPC Plus might provide a vehicle to continue what we call the common model. Now, the common model was between Care First and Medicare, but Care First and Medicare together are half of all the people in the state and half of all the dollars. We're also interested in whether it could be extended to dual eligibles, at least those dual eligibles that are in the community and not in an institution or not completely disabled. Obviously, that's not everybody. That's a subset. But if it could, it would be a logical extension to test further whether, when you get that much of it, the action together on a common model, do you get a result? We've been very encouraged by the results we've seen. And the savings to the company, just to, I want to be careful about this, in 2015 alone was close to $200 million of avoided cost. That is not retained by the company. That goes back to the customers in one of two forms. 3/4 of our business is self-insured. It goes right back in the form of lower claims that they have to pay. Or it goes into savings on premium rates for individuals and small groups. With the advent of ACA, there have been, I would say, horrific underwriting losses in the individual market that we and others have experienced. To some extent, this helped offset that. Had this not been in place, those losses would have been that much worse. We're trying to catch up to the point under ACA where you can at least break even. So through the years, we have done it now for 5 years on a region-wide scale, $20 billion flowing through the program. We have done 50,000 care plans a year on this population. And you'd think you might learn a thing or two about how to do a care plan and who you should do a care plan on. And what we found was that you have to be really, really careful who you do care plans on, not just those that are sick and need a care plan, which is a large group of people, but those who are sick need a care plan and are highly vulnerable, and were it not for the care plan, would break down. Not just anybody that is sick, or you wind up adding care costs, adding costs to the system. So anyway, against this whole backdrop, we asked physicians in the last month or so when CPC Plus came out, if there was ever a chance to continue the common model and extend it, would you be interested? No commitment. We don't know whether we could ever get it. We don't know what the details of it would be, but just would you be interested? And we'll be back here if anything happens. It was that kind of thing. In a few weeks, we have had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds say yes. We would be interested. I expect it to go into the several thousand range. And this is in a very compact period of time. It is nothing but an indication of interest. Nobody's bound by anything. We don't even know what the terms of go forward would look like. But it shows you, I think, the level of interest that's out there. So, I mean, from our point of view, that's where we are in our exploration of CPC Plus. And if the state were interested in adding to that dual eligible, at least some portion of the dual eligible population, of what we said, Donna, you were in the meeting, to Ben Mitchell and others is, well, we would certainly be willing to work with you on that and do it together. So I think that's where we are in answer to Gene's question. Yours, Jack.
Are you looking at doing another innovation project, or is it going to be through applying through CPC Plus?
Not as an innovation award. There are no more innovation award grants, so
this is going to be through the traditional program.
It would have to be, we think, through CPC Plus.
Okay. Thank you. One or two comments, and thank you, Ted. Willarda.
Yeah, having just returned from the American College of Physicians meeting, we this past week in DC, we had a lot of discussion around the CPC Plus program, as well as what's going on with alternative payments and so forth. And just as a primary care provider, and also one that participates in the Care First PCMH program, and very much believe in what's going on. My first thought about the track 1 and the track 2, and I think it's going to be among many of other physicians who also are maybe not as informed as we are around this table. My thought is, yes, I would like to participate in another program that is very much like what I am very enthusiastic about with PCMH. But anyway, we're talking about something that's totally separate from what we're doing right now with PCMH and the track 1 and the track 2, and I look at the track 1 and the track 2. My thought is, I'm going to go with track 1 where they still maintain the fee for service, something that I am very much accustomed to and very much familiar with. And then when they say they're going to give me a payment per patient per month, that's a system that then brings up HMOs and all the history behind that is bad in terms of as a primary care doctor, in my thoughts, and those of others who are in private practice. And then I say, well, I'm not sure I want to do that, especially when people are talking about I'm going to give and then I'm going to take it away. There's a lot of hesitancy in doing something like that, so I can just let you know that many of us that are thinking about it would think probably to go with a track 1, although everyone throws a lot of numbers around with track 2 and what they're going to give you and what they're going to take away. There's still that comfort level, as I said before, with the fee for service and going with track 1. Now, putting on my other hat as being a member of this advisory council, if we start talking about doing something that's going to help individual practicing physicians do better in terms of both providing better care, providing the social services support that our patients need in order to be able to get better care and improve the quality of care that they're receiving and the outcomes that they're going to have. And we're going to do this as a state and trying to achieve our goal in terms of what we want to do for Medicare and what we want to do for this MACRA and the alternative payment. I'm all for working together on doing that. I'm just not sure how many people are going to be able to do that without being completely informed about what we're talking about doing and what the accountability is going to be and what the measurements are going to be. It's going to take a lot of education in order to get everybody on the same page and in agreement with what we're doing. That's my thought.
Appreciate that. Peggy?
A quick question. Is it mutually exclusive? If you're in an ATO, can you still participate in
I think it's mutually exclusive. I don't think you can be in both at the same time.
Okay. What I'd like to do now, thank you. And I'm sure we'll be returning to that, and maybe we'll get an update at the next meeting, because that June 1st deadline will have come and go, and we'll have you brief us all on how that worked out. I'd like to return to the question that Carmela raised, that has to do with, I mean, I think as she put it, but you know, if I don't capture this right, Carmela, I'll give you a chance in a second to put it in your own words again. It's better to get it right than to meet some specific deadline that, you know, may not relate to how long it takes to build this. It's better to get it right, take the time we need, and, you know, negotiate that out with the federal government, than to rush to judgment and find ourselves doing something that might jeopardize what we've already achieved or from building it out. Did that sort of get it right? If you want to state it better in your own words.
Or maybe just a couple of clarifications, because I think we do ourselves a disservice sometimes when we talk about this, because it isn't about going back, and it's not about putting a genie back in a bottle. I don't think anyone is saying that, and certainly the hospital community isn't saying that. But I think it's, you know, the analogy, can you build a house in a month? Yeah, maybe. But is it going to be built well? Yeah, you know, don't know. I think what we're talking about is creating a set of never-been-tried-before incentives that all fit together, and we need to get it close to right. And I say that as, if I may invoke, hospitals being the only entity around this table who are currently held financially accountable for these outcomes. And Willardo, to your point, it's one thing to talk about policy concepts, and these folks at the end of the table are held accountable every day for implementing and operationalizing this system that we're talking about. And those are two very different things that I think we need to be cognizant of. To me, I look at slide 15, and Chet, even some of the things you've just said, that there are questions here. And David, I get that deadlines are important and can sometimes be helpful. But look at the questions we're raising. We're talking about implementing an initial CPC plus model. Chet's just outlined a picture of that. It is mutually exclusive. So providers have to choose either CPC or an ACO. We've got half of the hospitals in the state already with an ACO. The implication of these choices will be very dramatic in terms of the shape of the delivery system and the partnership arrangements that ultimately occur. We talk about developing a custom primary care model. I'm interested. I don't know what it is. Conceptualizing the geographic model. I don't know, David. I can't describe what the geographic model is yet. I'm interested in having more conversations, but I think it's very difficult to have a group like this sign on to a strategic plan when we haven't yet dug into the pieces and what they mean, if signing on to that strategic plan, as it did first time around in the waiver, and I think there are 4 of us in this room who were in those negotiations, when you sign on, you sign on. And I think we just need some greater clarity about these pieces. And these, I think, and Donna, many thanks to you and your team, these are important potential options for us to explore. But I don't know what impact that these will necessarily have on the total cost of care. Are these the right ones? Are there others? I just think these are all critically important questions for us all to be able to shake our heads yes to. That yes, these are the right steps to take. These are the right options. These are better than some others. And here's the direction in which we should go. So I guess that's my point. It's not to suggest that we shouldn't keep moving. In fact, we all ought to be leaning in on this. But I think there's a bit of artificiality to December 31st when I think of the potential for this group having 5 to 6 more meetings to try to get.
Okay, Chad.
Just react to that in a minute. I agree with virtually everything that Carmela said, but I would draw us back to what you showed, Donna, on slide 10. That quote is worth focusing on. You just have to be careful. It's hard to go back. Prior to the beginning, 2017, Maryland would submit a proposal for a new model. It does not say submit a plan for how you intend to get to a new model, which shall limit at a minimum the Medicare per beneficiary total cost of care growth rate to take effect no later than December 31, 2018. Now, if we say that we want multiple models, what are those models? To Carmela's point, what's a geographic model? Pick one. What is that? And I think what's contemplated in this language, and I was very much involved in the negotiations at the time, I think the expectation at CMS was you will come back to us with a model of how to do this, not a plan. While I agree with everything that what Carmela said, I don't think we can go to them with just a plan that says we'll get to a model or multiple models. If there are multiple models, how are they harmonized? The point you make about you're either in an ACO or you're not, or you're in CDC plus, you can't be in both, but those have a helter-skelter pattern that ripples through the whole system. If multiple models are to be developed, how are they to be harmonized? And then ultimately, who is it that is accountable for them? And if it always comes back to the hospital, what the hell am I accountable for all of this? I don't even know what it all is. I'm just a little fearful of getting to the end of the year or close to the end of the year and we have a plan but not a concrete model or more than one concrete model. And if that were ever to occur at a time when the total cost of care standard that we have to live with was in some way pressured, you might trip a trigger here that stay on course for losing $2 billion a year. Not the goal, obviously. I just want to underscore, how do we read this language?
We have lots of tools in our existing model. In fact, we have a differential tool that we could utilize if we need to, if we're not making the numbers, because we're trying to administer an all-payer model, and we have Medicare tests, and so we negotiated those before. So I don't want to. I think we need to focus on driving a plan forward and talk our way through a plan, and not focus on a parade of awful, because yes, things can happen, and that's why we negotiated things in our current model that said we could do X if Y happened, and so yes.
First of all, I might be a little confused. I'm not sure how does the CPC Plus hold the hospitals accountable? I think wasn't that one?
No, that's
okay. And the fact that
it could, though. So I just actually want to tell you how it could hold the hospital accountable if we didn't negotiate something with CMS. If we have a total cost of care guardrail that says if you go over the guardrail, you have to get back in the line, you have to explain why, you might have to get back in line. Well, if we increase the cost of money coming to someone else by 3% of the total premium, that's a lot of money. And so all of a sudden, if the non-hospital costs go up and it drives up the total cost of care by 3%, and we haven't worked that out with CMS in advance to say, hey, you're not going to measure this when you're doing the total cost of care guardrail. Yes, it could affect the guardrail. So if we're going to do, this is one of the conversations that you gave us advice on, to say, hey, if you're adding things on, you need to work it out with CMS of how it's going to relate to the hospital model that we've negotiated. There was no MACRA when we negotiated the hospital model. We have this new thing called MACRA. and MACRA could put money in and out of the doctor's fee schedule, and it has nothing to do with how we're delivering care in Maryland and if we're doing a fabulous job. So we need to have a conversation with CMS about MACRA to say, hey, guess what? We really need to have some protection on MACRA as we get into a total cost of care discussion, because the implementation of it could go like this. And CMS should want every doctor fully engaged in MACRA and really doing a great job to pull forward. Well, that would be awful if we developed a model in Maryland that didn't recognize that and say, this is a good thing. And so I think it does have an impact, and we do need to recognize it, and we need to negotiate it with CMS, and we need to put that in our strategic plan, and we need to go talk to CMS about MACRA, and we need to talk to them about some of these other things too. But that's a very clear example of how it does interact with the total cost of care. If you get in early and you get a 5% bonus, it's going to increase the cost. If every doctor got in on the ground at 5%, it would be $100 million. So $100 million is $100 million. A lot of money. We should want you to be involved, but we shouldn't make it a penalty for somebody else in the construct of things. Do you see what I mean?
No, I understand. It's just that we've discussed the fact, I think it was mentioned a few times, providers have to take some risk. Now, here's a program where providers can take some risk and have some potentially good upside potential. And Chet has described the positive attributes of this PCMH program, which only adds weight to the fact that this will probably work. And I think some of the provider angst is because they haven't heard all that. They don't realize that it's worked in the PCMH program. And at the same time, we have these other issues that are interfering with, the hospitals as well. And I understand that, but we have to have both.
Right. We can't let one part of the system stop the other part of the system from moving forward, and so we need to figure out how to make that work.
Yeah, Eric. Oh, I'm sorry. And then Gary. Eric.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I do have to disagree, Chet, with you on this one. Again, the words, they say what they say. We're stuck with the words as they've been written. I think Donna's done a nice job of highlighting things that have happened in the Medicare program external to us since these words were written, and I think have to be taken into account. And I would hope that CMS would be open-minded enough about this to understand that a strategic plan, as opposed to a specific model. I mean, if you really want to interpret the word, it's a new model. It's not potential new models. But that's kind of ridiculous in the world that we live in. I mean, by that definition, we could rule out PCMH and go only with ACOs. I don't think you'd advocate in favor of that. I think it is going to be a more pluralistic thing. And I would also say that, so now I'll be a stickler on the words. It's a new model which will limit at a minimum the Medicare per beneficiary total cost of care. It's not a Medicare per beneficiary total cost of care model. It doesn't suggest in any way that we have to bring other elements of the healthcare system under the regulatory regime. I mean, I think that you could put forth a model that is pretty close to what we've got today, perhaps with expanded use of ACOs, perhaps with expanded use of PCMH and some other wrinkles. And you could say that is actually designed to accomplish what we were required to accomplish, right? And so, whether the December 31st date is so cast in stone, you make an argument, I hear that argument. Like, on the other hand, I don't know exactly where we are, right? We could be blowing the lights out on this metric today. I don't think any of us know that. Donna may know it, but the data isn't widely shared. I think even the report says we got 2014 data. We don't actually know what 2015 looked like yet. We did pretty well in 2014. So, where we go with this, I kind of like the way Donna structured it on a strategic plan. The elements of that, I Donna's laid out a set of elements. I disagree with some of the elements. You probably disagree with some of them as well. And the beauty of doing it as a strategic plan is as we have that debate, we'll further limit what the elements of that strategy will be to pieces that we can all feel comfortable with, and then can perhaps get to that goal. And there may be pieces where Donna's articulated it in here, but we look at it and we say, actually, that's not going to work for X, Y.
Maybe that argues for constant dialogue with CMS as this goes along, so that we're not thinking one thing and they're thinking something else.
I agree with that. Yeah,
Let's go to Gary.
That was exactly where I was listening to the chat, and now to you, Eric. I was part and parcel back when this was created as well. And as I read this deliverable, that's what, as Chet read it, my memory says that's the way I remember it, what the deliverable is. But, again, Eric, your input. So I think, the conversation, what's the expectation with CMS? Is it a actual model? Is it a plan to have a model? Those are two very distinct things that I think we need to sort out and see what the real expectation is.
I'd add to those, I think the date is in question as well. I mean, I think there are many of us who are very uncomfortable with the date because of not knowing exactly where we are and what we're trying to accomplish. That ought to be a part of the discussion with key stakeholders at the table with CMS to have that conversation. Again, it's, if somebody has a notion in their brain of what the end point is of this, we ought to put that out on the table. But if the end point is actually to save money and to have raise quality and things like that that are part of the triple aim, that's a very different issue. And there's many different ways to get to that. I'm very reluctant, though, to stake out, here's where we want to go, here's the end point, and the end point is defined as a model.
How do others feel about this? This is an important question. Bob.
I think we're talking about plan model. We're really talking about degree of specificity and what we're going to propose here at the end of the calendar year. And you think about where we are, we're halfway through this. We all acted in good faith. You could argue that we've had very positive results. I think it's a great time, and maybe you're doing this, but we know the folks at CMMI to some degree and other CMS people. Why wouldn't we want to sit down and have an open conversation without being that specific necessarily about where we want to go, but just simply say, hey, listen, we did this at a point in time, and now we're here. There's been a lot of changes. In general, you see us moving in the right direction. We don't want to put more down on this paper than we can necessarily deliver. We don't want to, it's not good for you, it's not good for us. What degree of specificity are you looking for? And that way, because I'd hate to see us get up close to the end of this calendar year and then find out, they were playing baseball and we're playing football. It wouldn't be good. Stakes are too high.
Yeah. So you're saying instead of, I'll get you in a second, Stan, instead of the sort of plan versus model, or you can't plan unless you have a model, it may be more sequential and moving in the direction. It's not all or nothing. Yeah.
We just need to ask the question.
Yeah, we should find that. How much do we have? And it's not an all or nothing that there's this big model that's fully baked, perhaps.
As our work evolves, stay in touch with them and then bounce things off. I mean, if that's possible. I don't know if I know they've had personnel changes since this thing was written down.
Well, the secretary and the department, and we have been meeting with them we meet with them we've been meeting with them every 2 weeks. So we're in very close touch with them constantly, but it doesn't hurt to start to call the question even more as we start diving down into the direction. But there is super regular contact with CMMI, and the secretary has scheduled meetings with the leadership of CMMI to discuss our progress as we get advice from the advisory council and as we develop documents to discuss that. But there may be some other forums that could be appropriate too.
Dan, and then I think I saw David.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One is the maximalist reading of this language, which Chet identified, it seems to me is completely unrealistic. And it would have been unrealistic when this was entered into. To imagine that the state could pioneer a new model of hospital payment and at the same time come up with one model through which inpatient and outpatient care and post-acute care is all integrated and aligned together. And to do that in a several-year period, that's just not very realistic from the outset. And then that would be even if nothing changed, and things have changed. There's macro, which has changed a lot. And so I wasn't involved in the negotiations, but I can't imagine that sensible people thought that the maximalist interpretation of this language was feasible. It's certainly not. I think we're all in agreement. That's first thought. Second thought is that I think Bob's point is well taken about communicating with CMS and trying to make sure that our expectations are aligned. One thought I have is rather than simply going into the conversation with open-ended questions, it might benefit us to go into those conversations with a clear vision of what it is that we want. You're often getting, obviously everybody knows, you're more likely to get success if you say, well, what do you think about this, as opposed to, well, what do you want? And then maybe they wanted something very different than a reasonable proposal that we put forward. That's the second thought. Third is, here's an endpoint that occurs to me that might be reasonable and that might be feasible and that might address whatever CMS's concerns are about a desire for specificity. And it seems to me that by the end of the year or some other similar point, we might be able to say, look, it seems to us, here are a couple of models, specific models with details, as we've been talking about, that we think are worth pursuing. Here's some geographic models for post-acute care, for primary care, there's some various other kinds of models. And, we are not yet in a position, December 31st, 2016, to know which of these models will succeed, which will fail, etc. But we are committed to testing them. Here's how we plan to test them. And here are the metrics we plan to use. And here's how we plan to scale them up with incorporating lessons learned if they succeed. So it seems to me maybe, just sort of thinking out loud here, one endpoint might be that at the end of the year we arrive and saying, here's some concrete models for integrating hospital services and non-hospital services that we plan to test, and here's how we plan to test them, and here's what we plan to do with the test results. That doesn't force us, in the next 8 or 9 months to solve, incredibly difficult healthcare delivery and financing system reform problems that have challenged the entire nation. We're not going to do that in a few months, but we may come up with some promising models and some sensible strategies for how to test them by the end of the year or soon thereafter.
Thank you. Interesting thoughts. I'm looking for these, just these kind of discussions that get us away from an all or nothing or, highly split position to something that all of us think are sensible. David.
So I was going to bring up something not unlike what Dan said, but less eloquent. If I were CMS, and by the way, in December of 1948, the only person in senior leadership at CMS that you can predict will still be there is Patrick Conway. Everyone else is gone. So I think the CMS you're going to be dealing with is going to be a different CMS, and probably only partially bound by previous conversations. But putting that aside, there are not an infinite number of ways of skinning this cat. If I were CMS, what I would want to see is that Maryland has accepted responsibility for total cost of care for Medicare patients. And that's where I would want to see, because I wouldn't really much care about anything else, but I want to be able to say to my boss, who runs the Medicare program, if you're dealing with CMMI, that these folks in Maryland have thought enough about this so that I can see a pathway to controlling the total cost of care. They've got 3 ideas. They've got 3 possible pathways. They're going to experiment with them for 2 to 3 years. Each of the elements, each of the building blocks, it's plausible. It's I can bet the taxpayer dollar on it responsibly. And that's what I would think of as being responsible as a member of the CMS, as a member of the administration looking at journals. So you can get to that point, I think you'll be fine. But I think just to say we've got to plan the plan probably would not make me feel very comfortable about letting things go. Just a guess about where you're going to expect. Now, the other thing that you'll find, and that it's very hard to anticipate, is the internal dynamic that goes on in a transition.
Yeah.
And so what the attitude toward demonstrations, toward waivers, the cautiousness that occurs when there's no real senior management, those are all unknown, but very important.
Good. How do others feel? And in particular, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts about what those 2 or 3 approaches might look like: pathways, elements, building blocks, were all terms that Stan and David used. We don't have to get granular on this, but and what sort of accountability, as Chet was talking about, could be featured in those models? Could we initiate that conversation today? We don't have much time left. We could pick it up again next week, Chet.
Just to pick up on all the themes here, if it were possible through dialogue with CMS, not to have a plan for a plan, but several different concrete models, it would seem one could be around PCMH, around primary care, because you don't want to ignore that. That's one of the central things they're interested in. Another could be physician-hospital alignment, make that more concrete. And the third could be post-acute care, which we know that they are very interested in. It doesn't solve everything, but it does give a platform to go forward in certain defined ways that would complement what's already being done. There are several more ideas, but at least I think 3 along those lines, which show that the state is seriously seeking to deal with the central issues they have said that they are concerned with. Don't bite off more than you can chew. The danger is trying to do too much too soon, and I agree with this, is you can't do anything well, and it's all confused. Then you set yourself up for failure. That's the most disastrous thing of all. So the reason I raised the language is I was there at the time. I know what was meant, which is what it says. I also agree that things change, and that the team changes, and the reality changes. And to make changes in the real world, of the magnitude we're talking about, in this period of time, to build on what Stan said, I think is a valid point. You just don't want it interpreted on the other side that says, we really aren't moving towards anything particularly concrete. We just want more time. And I think all I was trying to give voice to is that that's a real danger if that's the way they read it, when $2 billion is at stake. I don't feel like I need to say that. I think everybody realizes that. So we face an edge, I guess, here. God knows what happens if Donald is the president versus Hillary. But that's imponderable.
We'll make a deal. There'll be some changes at CMS. Peggy.
Just to echo some of the comments. One is appreciate deadlines. They're all important, particularly several of us in academia. We know deadlines well, both personally and professionally. But there's a difference between a deadline and reality. And we, at the hospital level, are advocating for some level of extension. There's still too much heavy lifting that we need to understand in order to put potentially these models together. The deadline, from a federal government perspective, they should appreciate what happened with ICD-10. How many years did that have to get extended because it was not ready. So it's industry and organizational readiness, and those variables are not in place. Carmela does not have the confidence. We do not have the confidence of CEOs at this point in time to be able to say there's adequate funding, there's data sources that are readily available to help us understand our current and future state. The structures are not in place. The accountability structures are not in place. There's too many unknowns to be able to hit a hard deadline in terms of the expectations with CMS. And so from that perspective, any extension to continue to get this model correct, I think works to our advantage. And two, one of the primary themes of the first advisory group, which we were members of, is focus. And so the more we can stay focused on perhaps the models that you're describing and put a package together that has a level of focus and specificity that we can appreciate, I think is going to be critical for us to stay focused.
Thank you. Carmela, any thoughts? I mean, you've been listening to all these. Thank you for teeing this up. Do you see some things coming together that could reconcile some of the points of view?
Just a couple of thoughts. And Chet, I think you laid it out nicely. I think a few meetings ago, under the category of focus, Peggy, I think I said, if all we did were three things, global budget, post-acute care, and a physician alignment model, would we be largely there? And I think it's a reminder that all of this doesn't have to be stuffed through the hospital window. One could imagine a separate contract. I'm looking at Izzy, a separate contract focusing on the post-acute care. Maybe that's a bundled payment approach. Maybe it's skilled nursing facilities and global budgets, whatever that might be. But I don't know that we have to push that through the hospital window. And I think that's a very important point in the current draft. We don't want to lose the core of this that we've been working on for 40 years as we experiment with some of the other pieces. So I think of it, I separate the desire to integrate the delivery of care from contractually what are we agreeing to with CMS. So I think there are a core few pieces that could get us there that we could work on and focus on. We're going to have to move really fast.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know that my members would necessarily be opposed to a separate contract for our stuff. I will say that some of the frustrations that have been occurred is that we're trying to fit two things together that aren't always supposed to be together, and then we run into issues where our concerns are X, Y, and Z, which aren't even on the hospital's radar. So that is an outcome that I would, if that's something we could talk about, I think we would love to have that discussion about how do they treat us differently. And obviously, it's not going to look like the contract you have with the rate settings and similar, but maybe there's something we do different here with us that's separate. So 3 contracts under Chet's 3 buckets, in my mind, is not necessarily the end of the world result. That might be easier for us to manage.
So thank you, what would be most helpful in prep for the next meeting? I mean, I think we're teasing out some ideas here that have the potential for some consensus going forward among you as you agree what advice to give to the agencies. You have a draft before you. There's some fundamental concerns about some parts of it. I get that. What could we do between now and then, to resolve some of these issues, as well as address the question of progression? What might be your advice to Don and Howard and others as to, in keeping with your point, Carmela, on focus, and what first, what second, how to advise on the timeline? And there's not only what to put in the plan whenever it's submitted, but also how it evolves, and in some way that what you do in the second period builds on what you achieve in the first period. So there's some logic to it, evolving toward a model that would be someday fully developed. So what would you like to see? I mean, where should we go from here is my question.
Can we get an answer before the next meeting? Maybe we can. To Bob's question, about what is actually going to be acceptable or not acceptable. What are they currently? And I know that after the elections, no matter who wins, a lot of the folks are going to change. I get that. But can we get an answer for what they think today they're expecting us to give them? I thought that was a very good point, because once we know what we're supposed to do, we can decide whether we can't do that and we have to ask for an extension or a change, or maybe what they're asking for is something we already have enough consensus, and we can write something out that is as simple as the three buckets that you've differently described the same way. So I think that would be really helpful for us, so we know whether we have to freak out and start calling everybody about an extension and changing it, or whether we can go, oh, this isn't as bad as we thought.
And can I add to that? I was whispering, for those of us who this is our second time around, at the first rodeo, there was a really important point in time where it was stakeholders and the HSCRC sitting down with CMS together, and that ability to look across the table and to engage in that conversation took many of us from words on a piece of paper to more of a trusting relationship and an ability to say yes when there were never going to be enough words on a piece of paper. I really think we're potentially at that point on this critical question. I think people need to hear firsthand, along with the state, what are CMS's expectations that can get us over this.
And we are in the process of organizing year 2 meeting, as Carmela described year 1 meeting as the victory lap. So we're in the process of organizing the meeting, and last year at the meeting we had the opportunity to have some critical conversations with CMS last year. So I think we're putting our foot on the gas pedal to get that organized here coming up in June or early July, before summer vacation season gets in full tilt, hopefully. So I think that is a good time to have a conversation with the stakeholders with CMS about where we are in the planning process and what we're expecting to do, and have that discussion, have that critical conversation with CMS, with the stakeholders at the table with us. That's I think it's good timing to do that.
I'm going to get to Bob in 1 second. First, I wonder if Bruce is still on the phone, and if so, I apologize. I should have asked this question 45 minutes ago. But Bruce, are you with us, and do you have any advice?
I think the idea of a meeting with the relevant people at CMS and the commission and the stakeholders would be a very good one. So I at this stage, rather than sitting around talking about what CMS really wants or might want to do or so on and so forth, it might be very productive just to ask them.
Okay, thank you, Bruce, and thanks for sticking with us all through this. I know it's difficult on the phone. Bob?
I'll come back to this issue of data and in getting us all comfortable with where we are and potentially where we're going. At least I hear constantly CMS is slow, they're incomplete, and that there are a lot of issues around their ability to deliver timely data that we can all be comfortable with. Is that something now to put on the table with these folks? Or maybe you do this, I really don't know. I'm not.
Yeah, I would absolutely. I'm sorry, I would absolutely push on the data issues as part of that conversation.
We have prepared a memo for you on data. There's a lot of data that's available now. So I think just trying to make clear what's already available and what you already have, and what we've been working on that you can have, and then we are focused on this amendment and trying to get operational data. So there's a lot of data for strategic planning, but getting operational data and monitoring data in the hands of the providers, the hospital providers and the nursing home providers and the doctor providers, and getting the data out there. So I think that is part of the amendment plan. And can we accelerate that even more than we have? I think the state is focused on trying to put the maximum heat on the situation to try to get the data out as fast as we can. But we do think we have a plan, an effective plan to get it for the hospitals now, based on this amendment process, which we need to roll out through the hospital community on how to get the data. But I don't want you to think that there's not a ton of data that you already have. You already have a ton of data available, and we'll lay that out in the memo for you.
Patient-specific?
Oh, yes. I mean, you have a ton of patient-specific data that's been organized for you at,
CMS, so that they would.
That's through the Maryland, the HSCRC data has been a significant amount of patient-centered data that's been organized for hospitals at CRISP. So it's been laid out so that you can utilize it to focus on complex and high-needs patients. And that doesn't say that we don't need more. We do need more, and we need to put our foot on the gas pedal, but we have a lot of data available on a patient-centered basis through CRISP already specifically for care coordination. It can't be used for anything else. It's limited for provider use. It can't be used for marketing or anything. It's very limited in its use, but it is organized and ready to go. And we are focused on, we've been working with SSS, our vendor, to focus on getting reports out on total cost of care, broken down by zip code, et cetera, and so forth, and being able to drive those out. We've been sharing those with the hospitals and with monthly webinars with the hospital finance folks, and we've been starting to introduce them to the long-term and post-acute folks to say, hey, how can we start sharing some more information? And so we're working on that. But that's more at a high level. That's not patient level. It's very high level. It's not very high level, but you have to have cell sizes above 10 to make sure we don't have any confidentiality issues. But we're working on that. And then there are public use files, PUF files, that have patient-level data in them that hospitals can already get. They are available for multiple years, and you can look at quite a bit of detailed data in those PUF files. So, and at a patient level. Anyway, so we're going to send the data memo out, but we wanted to talk about the strategy and not to get too bogged into the details of the data discussion here.
Yes, Joe.
Listening to the conversation, I like the focus that suggests we've got some activity in play on the hospital component. The piece we have the cleanest ability to experiment with, and that our second phase is to begin to try to figure out the physician pieces and the skilled nursing or post-acute pieces. One of the things in the trenches is that the physician issues are very diverse depending on categorical. Primary care physicians have a whole series of challenges as the entry point for most people into the system. We have hospital-based practices like the emergency room and the hospitalist that have a different set of issues that I think deserve thought and experimentation. Proceduralists have their own set of issues to be, everything from infection rates to readmission rates at physician level. And then you've got sort of the tangential players that we probably ought to just acknowledge probably aren't core to pathology. where they're just not going to drive a lot of costs one way or the other. As it relates to the skilled nursing facilities, what I'm seeing is that there's probably as much diversity in the skilled nursing issues as there is in physician issues, because at least in our community, they seem to end up with different patient populations. So they have a business strategy to be, the ventilator place from Georgia to Massachusetts. And, they get a patient population with very, very different needs than the facility that's, captures the aging population in a small geographic area like Boonesboro or Smithburg. And while I don't think every community ought to experiment with every group, I don't think that ought to be our plan, because the capacity to continue to add work to this is being reached. But I do think we need that flexibility in the communities to sort of set forth, this is the one we want to experiment with. And then identify models within population groups that have some modicum of evidence about them has proven to be very helpful to us. So I like the idea that next round would focus categorically in those three categories, and then maybe there's some pieces. We've certainly spent a lot of resources on care management, and so the idea of alignment within those and with care management in place, maybe it has a chance to work. I mean, we have a hard time getting skilled nursing facilities to accept care managers as they think. Not all of them, but some of them are just not comfortable with that. And they may not have a good reason to be comfortable with it today. So I like that idea, and I like that it's not, we don't get spread out too far, and I like the idea that communities or larger communities would have some flexibility to figure out where they want to start in their respective service area.
Good. Thank you, Joe, for reminding us that one size doesn't fit all. This kind of diversity. Yeah. Sure.
Just building on that, another thought. What might be helpful, just a thought. We've talked about provider-based buckets. So we've been talking about physician alignment and post-acute alignment. Another slice of this is by patient population. I think of the duals work that the state is working on. That's patient-based. And there's this geographic model. So there's perhaps a geographic approach to this. What would be helpful, perhaps, is to begin to put opportunities or test projects under each of those categories. And I don't know if we want to cleanly stay in one bucket or if we want to mix across buckets. But as an example, and Izzy, my apologies, I'm going to use post-acute care again as an example. Under the post-acute alignment, you might have a bundled payment approach. You might have a global budget approach. But it seems to me that what we should be thinking about that drives all of this is back to what's driven the hospital piece. Where is the potentially avoidable utilization? And so as we think about these models, what we're trying to get at are places where we can pull that potentially avoidable utilization out, and that may drive us in one model direction versus another in each of these categories. But it might be a helpful guide. We've been talking about a lot of different potential, I don't know what to call them. I don't want to call them models now, options, approaches, but maybe starting to sort and organize those. And then to the points that have been made, we're figuring out which ones are evidence-based, which ones have been shown to drive, and the potentially avoidable utilization in a skilled nursing facility setting may be different than in a physician's office setting, maybe different in different types of skilled nursing facilities. I just don't know the answer.
Yeah, like Interact and RED, for example, in the post-acute world, they're analogs to that. That's a very interesting idea. I think we're going to have to now move, in the interest of time and keeping our promise. This has been a a good discussion. It started to congeal in the last half hour. And we'll try to listen to everything you said and come prepared for the next meeting, which, by the way, is June 30th, I think. You should have gotten with your meeting materials sent out a calendar invite for the next two meetings, and I believe the next one is June 30th. It's now time for any of our guests in the back of the room who would like to make a comment or ask a question to do so. I think maybe we don't have any. You're always welcome. By the way, if you think of one an hour after you leave here, you can send us a note with ideas. We're always open to ideas from the public. Yes, Dan?
While the members of the public are thinking about what they want to say, I wanted to add a comment about your answer to your question, Jack, about staging and process and so forth.
Yeah.
It seems to me that one goal for us collectively may be to come up with a number of particular models for integrating hospital and non-hospital services that we are going to test in phase 2 of the waiver. And not simply to describe them in general terms, but to describe them with some level of specificity. And so that we can go to CMS and say, here are the 3 things, here are the 4 things, here are the 5 things we want to test. I don't know that we're necessarily going to be able to come up with all the details by the end of the calendar year, but we should be able to come up with enough that CMS is comfortable that we're not, planning to plan, but rather we have particular directions we're trying to pursue. Second thing would be to think about how we are going to test those models. The point that Joe made is really an interesting one, which is that one strategy would be to articulate a number of different models and then encourage different players in different localities to come together and say, okay, this is something that we in Howard County we think we can take care of, or this is something that in Holy Cross and Montgomery County we can do. That may be one approach. So local pilots, carefully studied and evaluated with lessons learned and scaled up to the rest of the state based on what we learned. Those were and then I guess the third thought is I wanted to reinforce Carmela's point about evidence, which is, this is the first meeting here I've been to of the group, and I think there is not a huge amount of research with very solid evidence showing improved patient well-being and slowed cost growth, but there is some. Project Red, for example, is mentioned in the paper. And so I think that as we think about what are the 3 or 4, whatever models we want to test, and what do the details look like, it would be very helpful to get a sense of, what are the models out there that are supported by very solid evidence. We did some work at Urban for Vinny's organization, Healthcare for All, where we look at models that incorporate the use of lay health workers, sorts that could be in a congregation. I think a lot of you know, Vinny's organization is doing a lot of work in terms of getting communities of faith involved. And we found there were a number of interventions that were supported by really solid evidence that incorporate the use of community health workers or nurses. But no doubt there are lots of other things as well. And I think it would be very helpful for us to collectively to get a sense of that evidence.
Yeah, we got some last year. Thank you. It's a good point from Dr. Amy Boutwell in Massachusetts, who is a physician, I think, at the hospital in Newton and also Mass General. And she studied this extensively and came to a couple of our meetings and brought that evidence to the table. And their counterparts to Amy in the academic world, think tank world, and in the private sector who are working for companies in Maryland, as well as university experts here at different, Hopkins, University of Maryland, so on. So those are some interesting ideas. You're right. There's not answered all the questions, but there's some good stuff out there, and we should take advantage of it. Some of it is in the report of the Care Coordination Work Group, which was published a year ago, because we culled a lot of that evidence. And you're right, not everything works, but some things do. Yes.
I just want to, on behalf of my colleagues, I'm sure, and others, I want to thank the HSCRC team for the heavy lift on the strategic plan. You can tell there's a lot of level of detail. It was early in our discussion at the advisory council back in the fall. Where's the roadmap? Where's the context in terms of of what we would call the, the value proposition, the deliverables, and it's a lot of very solid work in this document, so thank you.
Good. Okay. I think we'll call the meeting adjourned, and thank you for participating.